Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today, my guest is Robert Bosnak. Before I bring him on, just a couple of announcements. You can always get new episodes free on Rokfin, Odysee, and all podcast platforms. Check out Rokfin. This is where you get our premium content. And check out all the podcasts that we feature on the Forbidden Knowledge Network. You get those on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. Follow us on Facebook. All those links are also in the description. Finally, we're living in extremely unsure times, and an emergency food supply would be a perfect investment right now. Check out the experts in emergency preparedness, My Patriot Supply. Their nutritious, delicious food stays good in storage for up to 25 years. And right now, you can get up to $100 off a 4-week supply. Just click the link in the description and see what My Patriot Supply has to offer. Today, I want to welcome Robert Bosnak. He has been a Zurich-trained Jungian psychoanalyst for over 40 years and pioneered the Embodied Imagination method. He is author of several books, nonfiction and fiction, translated into a wide variety of languages. He is past president of the International Association for the Study of Dreams and founder of the Santa Barbara Healing Sanctuary. He organized a score of international conferences, among which a series of Facing Apocalypse conferences about apocalyptic imagination in politics. Robert, welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So glad to be on your show.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this. This is going to be a really interesting discussion. We're going to be talking about alchemy and how it's about the way we experience matter and the way matter appears to us, as well as discussing what creative, voluntary, and involuntary imagination is, and connections to magic. And a lot more, because you've got a very wide variety of topics we could cover and a very extensive bio. But this is your first time on. I'd love for you to tell us more about yourself, a little bit about your background, and what led you down the path you're on now.
Well, I was on a very conventional path. I'm Dutch, and I was training to be a lawyer. And then I got really ill and ended up in the hospital for 11 months. And then it was so-called cured, but after 3 months, it started again. And so I decided to do something else and moved to Switzerland to be in psychoanalysis, because I felt that it was something that was psychosomatically based. And so then in 2 years of doing analysis, all my symptoms cleared up. And I became really interested in the relationship between dreaming and body, because my analysis I was at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, where people worked a lot with dreams. And I was very interested in the relationship between dreaming and the physical body. Because it had such an important effect. And so over the years, I developed a method called Embodied Imagination. And during my time at the C.G. Jung Institute, everybody had to learn about alchemy, because, as you may know, C.G. Jung, who was one of the primary psychiatrists of the 20th century, was very interested in alchemy. He was a great collector of alchemical books, because he had found, and several psychoanalysts before him already, that the language of psychoanalysis is very similar to the language of dreaming. And so you could use psychoanalysis, you could use alchemy as a background for the psychoanalytic process. And then I became more and more interested in alchemy, and for the last 50 years, I've studied it.
Very cool. Now, I think a good place to start would be that you have 4 books coming out in the fall, I believe. And
they have just come out last week.
They've come out
on Amazon now.
Very excellent. And it's going to be your alchemy saga, Red Sulfur. Now, if you could tell us what are these books exactly going to be about, and what inspired you to write them?
Well, what inspired me to write him was that I was writing about 15 years ago. I wrote a more or less scholarly paper about a transmutation that has taken place in 1666. A transmutation is a transmutation from lead into gold. This was verified by such people as one of the leading philosophers of the second millennium, Spinoza, and by the mint master of the Netherlands. And Holland at the time was one of the leaders of the world. And so they were very much interested to catch anything that was false gold. So they were very good in testing it. They all tested the gold and found that it was real. And so then I came with the notion 10 years ago, what if it actually happened? Because the people that looked at it were so well respected in their day and age. And then I said, well, if that happened, then everything in alchemy could be true. And so then I started to write, and suddenly this bedraggled alchemist came walking into my imagination, and the story began, and he fell in love, and there were all kinds of complications that began to happen. And he was the last one to carry the red sulfur. The red sulfur is the philosopher's stone, the last one to carry the red sulfur in the world. And of course, he was pursued by kings and by phantoms because everybody wanted to get the red sulfur. The kings wanted it for warfare. And especially Louis XIV was very interested in it because he was building Versailles with all the gold that he needed for that. And so he was pursued, and he needed to have offspring, and the woman who he fell in love with couldn't have children, and she suggested that the person that she brought up as her daughter would have the children for her. And that, of course, brought incredible jealousies and a triangular relationship, a mother-daughter triangular relationship that was very hard to handle. And out of that were born the red sulfur twins, who turned out to be immortal and start a battle. And then it becomes very similar to something you could see in Marvel Comics. It becomes a battle between the red sulfur twins and the force that wants to use red sulfur to change the universe.
Now, for those that may not be familiar, could you explain the basic ideas of alchemy?
Alchemy was a science of healing. The alchemy was usually practiced by physicians, and they took all the metals and all the things around us as alive. So in the time that alchemy developed, there was only biology. There was nothing like physics. There was only biology. Everything's alive. So the metals are alive. And there is a sick metal, lead. And if you use the red sulfur or the healing, then this lead would start transforming into gold. And so it was a healing of a sick metal into a healthy metal. It would work also on humans. It was called the panacea. And it would heal the humans. And we now are studying that kind of stuff with the work on the placebo effect these days, which is very extensive. So the Philosopher's Stone is the core of creativity. Everything in the universe, according to alchemy, is arranged around creative sparks. So it's a difference between science now and alchemy then. In science now, at the core of the nucleus is energy, right? That's how you get the nuclear bomb or nuclear energy. In the alchemist time, at the core of every atom, because there were just as much atomists, there were just as much alchemists that were atomists as there are in science. At the core of the atom was the creative spark. So if you would undo the shell and the crust of all the elements, then you would be left with the creative spark, and then you could connect the creative spark and congeal the creative spark and coagulate the creative spark in something so concentratedly creative that it would change anything it touched.
Now, why do you think we don't hear about alchemy in mainstream academia and science? And when did this start dying away in mainstream practices?
Yes. The only place that you still hear about it is in the history of science. There's a very good history of science on alchemy, and there's some very good scholars on that. But in science itself, no longer. This changed in the 17th century. And so my story is set in the 17th century because that's when everything changed. At that time, still, the major scientists like Isaac Newton were alchemists. And so they were doing their laboratory work, and in their laboratory work, they were doing alchemy, but at the same time, they found the great natural laws of nature. So they were doing both. And then what happened was in the 17th century, there became the split between subject and object. The alchemist would work in a way of participating. So the alchemist would be participating in the life of the metals, and it would be a dialogue between the metal and the alchemist. And then in the time in the 17th century, and that, of course, we have the notion of that this was done by Descartes, but it was older, but Descartes formulated it, the Cartesian world, the split between subject and object. And then alchemy came into disrepute because in the 18th century, the main direction of science moved into subject-object, and thereby the technology that they created was absolutely remarkable, and alchemy just dropped out. There's still people that say they do alchemy, but I don't have much contact with them. Asclepius was a legendary physician. We don't know if he was historical, but he was certainly legendary. He must have lived around 1200 BC, and his followers, who followed Asclepius, were called physicians. So the physicians was a cult. It was a cult not in the bad sense, but it was a cult of medicine, and that cult of medicine was done by physicians. And one of the things in Asclepian medicine is the centrality of dreaming. In every healing sanctuary, there was a central point, and in that central point, you would go to sleep and you would get dreams that would be dreams of healing. This lasted for about 1,000 or more years. That the central force of Western medicine was about dreaming, and it was not about dreaming as we are now using it for emotional healing. It was dreaming for physical healing. So we find that in healing sanctuaries, people would go with broken legs, but also they would be working on, if they had a broken leg, they would still be working on dreams. And we find these days that in the studies of the placebo effect that imagination and expectation have an enormous influence on the healing process.
Now, how can we connect these healing sanctuaries to alchemy and dreams?
So as I said, the central element of the healing sanctuary it was called a place, the place was called an abaton. Abaton means the place where you don't go, the non-trodden place, the place where you have never been. And so dreaming would bring you into a place that you had never been before. The relationship to alchemy would be that it's a healing process, right? And alchemy is a healing process. Alchemy is about healing. So we started a healing sanctuary in Santa Barbara in 2011. And it was going on for about 9 years when COVID hit. And we did it in Santa Barbara and in near Mexico City. And there people would come with all kinds of illnesses, from MS and Parkinson's to depression. And they would come and we would work with them on their dreams, and they would be working with art and with yoga and with all kinds of non-traditional medicine ways, but it was all focused around dreaming, and from that healing processes would start.
Now, when you look at modern day, how do you think alchemy can be integrated in our modern lives to improve it?
I think that just knowing about the alchemical process puts things in a different perspective. I'll give you an example. You have a period in your life, and lots of people are going through this at the moment. You have a period in your life where you're going down. There's a sense of everything falling apart, a sense of isolation, a feeling of the darkness of night. We're in a kind of what could be called a dark night of the soul that has come along with COVID. And so if you go from the perspective that we should all be healthy, then we could see that this is something that is going wrong. If you look at it from an alchemical perspective, it's very different. Then you look at it, this is a period of what is called in alchemy nigredo, where everything has to fall apart and where the previous system has to disintegrate for something new to come into being. And so that is a very different background of thought, so that we're going now through a nigredo period where we are in what is called the alchemists called this an interregnum, a place between two states, where one state has disintegrated and the other state has not yet come into being. So we're in that state. And the alchemist says, what happens very easily and quickly is that the material crusts over. So we're under some kind of a crust. We have all this energy, but it's under a crust. We can't come to the surface. It's like we're under ice. It's all congealed. And so as we're trying to come up, we're pushing against the crust. And so the whole notion of alchemy would be that you start melting the crust. Now, the way that you would do that in alchemy as an individual process is to begin to notice what all happens in your body, because alchemy was always talking about bodies. Everything was a body. There was a metallic body and there was a physical body. They were all bodies. Everything was a body. So the earth is a body. We're in the body of the earth. We're inside the body of the earth. We know that now, how much we are inside the body of the earth, because we have global warming going on and tornadoes happening and all these kind of things. We're inside the body of the earth. That's what the alchemists would say. So that we are, and if we are inside the body of the earth, then the notion that we can pillage the nature as much as we want no longer works, because as we pillage nature, we pillage ourselves, because we are part of the world. So these are all alchemical thoughts that are very useful for today.
Do you ever see these alchemical traditions making a comeback in our modern lives?
Well, they have made a comeback in psychology. Psychology that is not the central thrust of psychology, but in psychoanalysis, they've made a return, and people are using terms like sublimation and coagulation and dissolution, and all those words are alchemical terms that we use in daily life. So I don't think that alchemy will make a comeback as physical alchemy. I do not think. I think that our method of working with subject-object, even though in quantum physics, as you know, that whole notion has been stranded, because we can no longer distinguish that in quantum physics, because we know that the observer is part of the observation. But that has brought, science has brought a technology that is unparalleled. And the fact that we can be talking now, I sitting in Australia and you sitting in America, and we can talk like this, that is pure science. Alchemy could never have done this. So for a technological perspective, I don't think alchemy is going to come back. But I think that that alchemy will be there as a way that we can approach our bodies and what's happening inside of our bodies. So it will come back. It will come back as an experience and as a science of experience. And I am what is called a phenomenologist. A phenomenologist is somebody who studies experience. And so in the study of experience in phenomenology, I think it's going to come back. And I think it is already coming back. And one of the reasons I wrote these novels is to make people aware of this incredibly rich tradition that we can say may not have been a physical tradition, but it was an embodied tradition. That's why my field that I've developed is called Embodied Imagination. It's an embodiment in a dream. When you're in a dream, somebody walks towards you. This person is entirely embodied. The person walks in a street. It's a completely embodied street. You have very strong emotions, completely embodied. So there are there is a quasi-physical world. It's not a physical world because we wake up out of it. There's a quasi-physical world that presents itself as entirely physical, and you know that you're awake. It's not that you think you're awake while you're dreaming. You know you're awake while you're dreaming. So it's a world where you know that you're awake experientially. You know that you're awake, and things around you are fully embodied. That world that we are exploring, which I call the involuntary imagination, the deep imagination, their alchemy is absolutely essential to study.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about starting with creative imagination. I guess tell us, first of all, about the history of it.
The history of creative imagination is very interesting. I would have to go back to about the third century, and you could go further back, but let's take a starting point, because 1600, 1800 years ago is a good starting point. At that time, there was a development of a new form of thinking that was based on Plato. It was called Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism had the notion that there were three worlds. There was a world of matter, this world, the world that we are talking in. There was a world of spirit, that these days we would call mind or mathematics, abstract thinking. That's another world. And then there's a world in between that partakes both of thought and spirit and of matter, and that was the embodied world, the world of the creative imagination. The creative imagination was just as real as the world of matter and the world of spirit. It's a world in between. And this world in between is of enormous importance in what we're doing, and it culminated somewhere in the 12th century, and then it went down. Then slowly, all of imagination became imaginary, and imagination became the opposite of reality, whereas up until the 12th century, it had been a form of reality. And that's the creative imagination that I'm exploring, is that real world, like a dream, that is experientially entirely real, and that you can explore and find real things happening that affect you both in your mind, in your spirit, and affect you in your body, because it's a world in between.
That's very interesting. Now, what about voluntary imagination, and what is the difference between creative and voluntary and involuntary imagination?
Yeah. The voluntary imagination is where you say to yourself, I am now sitting down and I will imagine a tree. And that's relatively easy to do. That's a voluntary imagination. The involuntary imagination is like a dream. I take dreaming as my paradigm for everything, because I have worked between 40 and 50,000 dreams in my professional life. And so I have a lot of experience in the world of dreaming, and I take that as my primary information. And so in dreaming, the imagination that surrounds you entirely is involuntary. You did not create this. I mean, if you say that you created this, then you're in some kind of a philosophy of individualism that may be something that your culture tells you, but from an experiential perspective, you did not change this world. You found yourself in it. And so it's a world that you find yourself in. It is a fully embodied world that you find yourself in, that is acting on you, and where the agency is not mainly in you, the agency is outside of yourself. So that is the involuntary imagination.
Why would you say that the involuntary imagination has a much further reach than voluntary?
Well, you would never, unless you are on some kind of drugs that are being used a lot in psychedelic drugs and things, in your ordinary mind, the world that you imagine is not as real as the world that you're in when you're dreaming. When you're in the involuntary imagination, you're in a world that is entirely real. The voluntary imagination is much more flimsy. And then also in the involuntary imagination, you can't mess around with it the way you can with the voluntary imagination. Let's imagine a tree, or maybe the tree is not really a tree, maybe it's a stick, and then you can move and you have influence over the images. In the involuntary imagination, you have very little influence on the images. The images are doing their own thing. It's a world that is doing its own thing, and you're doing your own thing, and you're in a kind of a dialogue with it. There is this in-between state, which is a very interesting one, which is called lucid dreaming, where you are in the involuntary imagination. You know that you're in the involuntary imagination, and you can steer it a little bit, not much, but you can steer it a little bit. And so then you have both conscious influence and involuntary imagination, but it's a very rare state.
Would you be able to give us some examples, such as, real life examples of how these are utilized?
Well, the way that the involuntary imagination is utilized very much is in the dream work that I've been doing. And so that, for instance, a person who goes through a cycle of rage and terror, right? That is, you can fill out your friends, and you know who I'm talking about. So they are enraged at one moment and terrified the next. A person like that has a dream, and they are walking down a street, and they see a dog behind them, and they're not afraid of dogs. This is an actual dream of a woman many years ago. And because the problem that I have, of course, I need permission to talk on air about dreams, so I have permission for that dream. And there's a dog behind her, and the dog comes closer and closer, and she sees it's a rabid dog, and she begins to run. And so in the running, she's very, very terrified. So what I do in the work is I help her feel the terror of running from the dog. And it's all this feeling is all in the chest. And then I help her through acting techniques identify with the dog, because like in alchemy, everything's a body, and you can participate in every body, in every body. So you can participate in the body of the dog. She can feel the body of the dog, in especially the jaws. I want to bite. Rage. And so now she can feel at the same time the rage and of the fear. And she can feel that in her body. Is there a dog there that begins to hear it? Yes, right. So as she feels both at the same time and holds both of them in her body, she begins to feel an opening up, and she begins to feel that she can be energized without getting enraged. And she can be, when she gets afraid, feel that force of that energy, so she doesn't get entirely terrified. So she gets into a mixture of these two states. And that is what you can do with the embodied imagination.
Could you talk about the difference between mental imagery and embodied imagery?
Yeah, it's a very important one. Let me give you an example from an old professor, not old, but I think we talked like 25 years ago, professor at Harvard, Stephen Coslin, and he researched imagery a lot, mental imagery. And one of the stories that I found through him was of the gymnastics team, I think it was of the United States. And they compared people who had made the team to people who did not make the Olympic team. And the people who made the Olympic team did their mental imagery very differently from the people who didn't make the team, because everybody's doing mental imagery, right? Mental imagery is ubiquitous through all sports. But the way that the gymnasts who got into the Olympic team did their imagery was they would feel every movement in their body. They could feel every movement in slow motion as they went through it in their body. Whereas the people who were doing just mental images were keeping it in their minds and thinking about how they were going through it and thinking about what they were doing. The people who made the team were feeling it throughout their bodies. That's the embodied imagination. What the other people were doing is a mental imagination, but these people are doing the embodied imagination. The embodied imagination is much more effective than mental imagination.
Now, when you talk about physical intuition in your books, what do you mean by that?
I take the word physical intuition from the scientist I admire probably most of any scientist of the 20th century. His name is Richard Feynman. He's a physicist. He was a physicist, one of the greatest teachers of physics. If anybody ever has interest in physics, study Feynman. And he was part of the Manhattan Project, which doesn't commend him to us, but he was part of the Manhattan Project. And when Oppenheimer would have a problem that he couldn't solve, he would send it to Feynman. So Feynman was an extraordinary physicist. And the way that he worked, people describe it, and he describes it, he lets his whole body become identified with the problem that he's studying. So, for instance, he's studying the movement of a particle or the movement of a beam. And what he describes is he feels in his body what he calls, I feel the wiggle and the jiggle, and he moves his whole body. His whole body begins to move. His arms begin to flail. His whole body, one of his students described coming into the room when Feynman was working on a problem. He was rolling on the floor and using his arms, and he was doing that until it was it stayed very fuzzy, but until he felt it was really there, and then he would start the mathematics. So that I call, that he calls the physical intuition. I think physical intuition is so important because it is actually alchemical. That is alchemical because he participates in the material and he lets the material work through his body, and that's the way the alchemists work. So this is an alchemical way of working physics.
You also write about how the body has its own kind of intelligence.
Yes.
You call it embodied intelligence. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, the word physical intuition and embodied intelligence I frequently mix up because embodied intelligence is that with your body you can know things that your mind doesn't know. You walk into a store and you can feel there's something wrong. There's something wrong here. You can feel it with your body. You have no idea why, but you can feel it with your body. And then suddenly somewhere over there, a crazy person begins to scream. These things happen in your body. Your body picks up things, and we are not trained to take them as important. But your body picks up things that your mind doesn't know yet. This also is in neuroscience. This is a neuroscientific notion, namely that the body knows things before the mind does. For instance, when you walk in a forest, and this is a very old example of neuroscience, it's like from the 90s or the 80s, and it was also used by William James in 1880. So it's a very old example. So you're walking through the woods and you see something there. You go like, ah, and you move back because what happens is that this thing that you see goes in through the eyes to the limbic system, mainly the amygdala. The amygdala warns the whole body. The body goes into a state of fear, and then the long path is that it goes then back to the vision center, which is in the back of the brain, and it takes several milliseconds longer. And then the visual cortex tells you this is not a snake. You don't have to be afraid, and then you calm down. But the first experience is a body experience. The embodied intelligence works before the emotional intelligence, before the intellectual intelligence. the embodied intelligence works first.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about possible manifestation techniques. To what degree do you think we have the ability to manifest certain outcomes in reality, or even, change physical matter?
Well, in the first place, you have to see that you're referring to, I suppose, to forms of magic. In the first place, you have to see that when you put a person who has never lived outside of their village in the mountains somewhere in an airplane, they believe that they are in a state of magic. So magic is that which has physical effects that we don't understand. I think that that's the definition of magic, physical effects that we do not understand. So the way that we've learned to manifest these days is by doing these remarkable things by way of technology. So you're probably focusing on how somebody can, without the intervening of physical technology, can create change. Right. So this is done very much in, I know it mainly from medicine and healing, because that is my field. That when you go to indigenous cultures, and for instance, I was and I wrote a book about it, with an Aboriginal medicine man called a Nunkari. And he would become, at night, he would become an eagle, and he put the patient on his back, and with the patient, he would fly to the center of the galaxy, and there he would fall on sticks that were put up by the ancestors, and these were healing sticks that would penetrate both him and the patient. The patient afterwards would know that this flight had taken place, and then he would go back down and put the patient back in their swag, and then healing would take place. So that was an effect that was taking place through what I would call embodied imagination. When I asked him, he said it's a physical thing that happens. And so what they call physical, I would call embodied. I do not know whether it was physical. In my world, I cannot imagine that he becomes an eagle. I cannot imagine that he flies to the center of the galaxy. So I believe in my world, this is embodied. It is that his embodied self is flying there as an eagle. But I think that his physical body stays in his sleeping bag in the desert. And so, yes, we can have physical effects in the embodied world, and that's what medicine is using all the time. We now, as I said that several times already, the study of placebo is getting more and more advanced, and we find that there's all kinds of manifestations that happen. We would call it magically. When, for instance, when a person has a lot of pain and you give them a painkiller, if you give them a painkiller behind their backs, you need much more painkiller than if you give it in front of them. So you can see that imagination has this enormous effect of manifesting healing. And but if you ask me about things about psychokinesis and psychokinesis, I have never seen, and and every time that I've seen it, it has been debunked. I have seen precognition, but it's very rare. But I've seen it, and I have known people who could distinguish their precognitive dreams from their non-precognitive dreams. So there is something there. I have no way to understand it. So there is something like precognition that exists. I have seen everybody is experiencing these faint telepathic moments where you think very strongly about a person that you haven't seen for a year, and suddenly they call you. These kind of things happen a lot. So there's some kind of telepathic thing, but how it works, I don't know. I just know it that people experience it.
Right.
And and then there are things like UFOs and the experiences of people who have been. I was in Cambridge at the time at a place at Harvard where they were studying extraordinary experiences and people who had been had an abduction experience. And so I worked with people who had an abduction experience, and I could not find the difference between an embodied experience and the physical experience. These experiences were entirely embodied. There's no doubt that these are embodied experiences, but I don't know if they're physical.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic to get into as well. But I want to talk about more about embodied imagination. You talked a little bit about how you pioneered and trademarked a method. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So embodied imagination works with the involuntary imagination. So it works with the way that imagination embodies itself around us all the time. If you are when you walk into a dark room, you walk in not just to a dark room, but also a dark kind of imagination. Anything can happen. That's how we get afraid when we walk into on a fair, one of these houses, these haunted houses. They scare us because as we move into the haunted house, we move into an embodied imagination of being haunted, and we get terrified by all kinds of tricks that trigger our embodied imagination of terror and of horror. So the embodied imagination lives all around us. And you can notice it very strongly when you are in a place where you've never been before. And you try to make out what is happening, what people are saying, what they're doing. You're inside an embodied imagination. Everything around you is fully embodied, but you have no idea what it is. It's like a dream. And so what we have developed is ways, especially with dreams, to flash back into the embodied imagination of a dream, and then not just work a dream from the perspective of the person who tells the dream, the so-called dreamer, but also from the perspective of others around. Like, for instance, before I talked about the dog, you can work the dream from the perspective of the dog through acting techniques of identification. And so we have worked all kinds of methods, and then we've put them against an alchemical background. Because as you put them against an alchemical background, you begin to understand them better. Like I said before, that if we put what we're going through, the imagination that we're going through, which is about rage. There's an incredible amount of rage going on at the moment. Polarization. There's an incredible amount of polarization. That is all embodied imagination. We are in the imagination that is rage, that where we feel stopped, where we have to push through. All these things is living deeply in our bodies. These are not things we have in our minds. You could see in January 6th that this embodied imagination of that the elections were stolen, that's embodied imagination. Everybody could feel it in their bodies that the elections were stolen. It has not. I depends what bubble you're in. I'm in the bubble where I think that it wasn't stolen, and so. But it doesn't. That doesn't matter. As you feel it, as you're in the imagination of that the election were stolen, whether they were or not. That the elections were stolen, you get into rage, you get into break-in, into changing, you get into violence. All that is part of embodied imagination, and that can be used by people who can build it up. You can use the embodied imagination to get it bigger and bigger and bigger, and enhance the rage. So I think embodied imagination is really, really important, and I've studied it especially from the perspective of apocalypse, and how the apocalyptic embodied imagination influences us.
Do you think that embodied imagination could account for what we consider a lot of times to be paranormal activity? You were talking about UFOs earlier.
Well, I have the luxury of being a phenomenologist, of being a student of experience. Mm-hmm. So the only thing that I'm interested in is, are these experiences real? Mm-hmm. I don't ask the questions, are they physically real? And when John Mack, who was the researcher in UFOs at Harvard, psychiatrist, Pulitzer Prize winner, who studied it, and he went to the Dalai Lama and asked the Dalai Lama about it, and he said, well, for us, it's not a problem because we have spirits in our cosmos that briefly materialize and then dematerialize again. And in another place, they materialize and then they dematerialize again. So these UFOs could materialize and then dematerialize. So the opposition that we have between the material and the immaterial is a very Western notion. They don't have that in Tibet, according to the Dalai Lama, who should know. And I think that we can I lost my train of thought.
We're talking about UFOs and the connections, to paranormal activity, embodied imagination.
Yes. And so embodied imagination is that which researches the experience of what happens. And then there are cultural notions that ask, is this physical or not physical, which apparently is a very Western question because the Dalai Lama doesn't ask that question. These questions I keep outside of my studies. In my studies, I only see, did people have a reality of experience? And how did that reality of experience affect them? And how embodied was that reality of experience? That's what I'm interested in.
Now, earlier you mentioned this kind of apocalyptic mindset and thinking. First of all, what do you mean by apocalypse whenever you're talking about it?
Apocalypse means revelation. And it's the revelation of a new world. But the way that we've been talking about it is that the old world has to be destroyed for a new world to come into being. So we're talking about the destruction of the old world before the new world comes into being, which is an alchemical notion of the destruction of one state for another state to come into being, right? And so the end of the world is the end of this world before another world comes into being. So anything that relates to end of the world can get into apocalyptic imagination. In apocalyptic imagination, we see doom, we see complete disintegration, we see the end of humanity. All that stuff is part of apocalyptic imagination. Now, it can attach itself to many things. The first Facing Apocalypse conference that I did in 1983 was about the nuclear issue, because in 1983, we were going to move into nuclear winter, and we would all freeze to death. And so I did this conference, and one of the participants of the conference was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he said, we should move this to Moscow. We should do this in Moscow. I said, yes, absolutely. And I will organize it, but you help me. And he helped me very much. And So I announced to the conference in 1985, we're going to do the same kind of conference about the nuclear issue and apocalyptic thinking in Moscow. People came up to me and said, in 1985, we're going to be in nuclear winter. There may not be a world anymore in 1985. So that is apocalyptic thinking. In the 80s, you probably will not remember, but in the 80s, there was a nuclear clock. The nuclear clock was constantly at like 7 or 8 minutes to midnight. That is apocalyptic thinking. We were in 8 minutes to midnight all the time. And then in 1990, I organized a conference about the environmental issue, because the environmental issue in 1990 was getting stronger, about global warming. So that was 30 years ago. And how apocalyptic thinking attaches itself to the environmental issue. And how dangerous that is, because if we live in a constant sense of doom, you can't do anything. You burn out. And in my opinion, we're going to be living in ecological disaster for the next 200 years. And so there are generations that are going to have to deal with it. And if we constantly are in 5 minutes to midnight, we cannot do it. It has to become, as we have to do ecological practices the way we brush our teeth. We don't brush our teeth in the hope that we will never get any decay, because decay may happen, but we just do it. And so, but you can't do it if you're in an apocalyptic state. And then I did a conference in Moscow finally, and that is the work of Claiborne Pell, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I did a big conference in Moscow in 1992 about holy war, which is another apocalyptic image, because at the end of the world, there is holy war. And so holy war became stronger and stronger. And if I would do an apocalypse conference now, it would be about polarization. We're now in the apocalyptic image of polarization, because in the apocalyptic image, two forces of good and evil are banging against each other. That's part of apocalyptic thinking. And you can see that, for instance, in America when they did the infrastructure bill, where 50 years ago that would have been bipartisan. And now people who voted from the Republican Party who voted for it were excoriated by their colleagues for voting for a bill to fix our bridges, because it was in the polarized image. So those are embodied images that we live inside of. So you could say that today we're living inside of a magnet that pulls us into polar directions and pushes us into polar oppositions. That's the magnet that we live in, and that's embodied imagination.
It seems like every generation seems to have a level of this apocalyptic thinking, right?
Absolutely, yes. And these days, it's the polarization.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you see that always will be the case, as long as...
Yeah, because I already see it moving again. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in it, so I see it moving again. There were 100 of the leading scientists were asked, what is the most dangerous thing in science? And the second most dangerous thing was global warming. The most dangerous thing that they saw was artificial intelligence. So the apocalyptic image is now attaching itself to artificial intelligence. And we can see this in movies like The Terminator or those kind of movies. Artificial intelligence is becoming the next apocalypse.
Do you think that collective consciousness can have this kind of, I guess, a manifestation effect to where it creates a different future and reality based on what the collective society is focused on at the time?
It depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist. It's funny because I should be a pessimist. I was born 3 years after the war from a people where families and everybody was destroyed. And so there was I'm a Jew. So my family, 6 million people. And so I should be pessimistic. But I'm not. I have the sense, and probably that came out of my psychoanalytic training, is that if we become more conscious of our impulses, if we can feel our impulses more deeply, then we don't have to act them out. Then we can feel them and we can contain them. This is important for any relationship that you have. If you feel that you are innocent, woe on your partner. Because we all have these dark sides. If we only see that we are light and they are dark, you're going to get these polarized notions. So if we can begin to feel that we're all a mixture and we are all in a mess, and if we begin to realize that there was never any better time, the notion of that there once upon a time was a paradise never existed. You can find discussions 2,500 years ago where people would say the world is going to hell in a handbasket. 2,500 years ago. It is all throughout history. We're always going to hell in a handbasket. That's permanent. We're permanently going to hell in a handbasket, and we have to deal with that. Yeah. And so I think that would be helpful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That was very well said. And Robert, thank you so much for coming on. That was fantastic information. For those in the audience that want to find out more about you, your books, what's the best way that they could do so?
They can go to Robert Bosnak at Amazon.com, and they can go to Jung Platform, JUNG platform.com, and look under my name, Robert Bosnak, and they will find all my hundreds of hours of teaching about alchemy if they're interested. But I would hope that people would take a look at Red Sulfur, my saga in 4 novels that has just appeared at Amazon.
Excellent. Yes, I will leave all those links in the description so everybody can check that out. And thank you so much for coming on today, Robert.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
It was. We'll have to do it again sometime. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening, and we will be talking again tomorrow.